Hello friends, this is Poohead189, and today we're going to be talking about Tolkien's view on evil, and if orcs are naturally immoral or not. Yes, this is a video that is being made in response to the discourse surrounding the second season of The Rings of Power, but really, this has been an argument that has been raging for decades upon decades at this point. Let it be known that I am not making this in response to Rings of Power. I did watch Season 1, thought it had some good aspects, but I made the decision it was deviating too much from Tolkien and have chosen not to watch Season 2. However, I am not criticizing the show. I have not even watched the scene people are criticizing. What I am responding to are the arguments around it. On one side, you have people screaming at Rings of Power for spitting on Tolkien's grave, because Tolkien believed in inherent good and evil and black and white morality, and placing orcs in a sympathetic light is disgusting. And on the other side, you have people arguing that Tolkien did not believe in good and evil, and that orcs should be seen as sympathetic, and that these people criticizing the show are fake fans. Of course, it also just devolves into a culture war thing. And also, of course, the answer is somewhere in the middle, as usual. I am speaking to these people because they are both wrong in most aspects, and slightly correct on one or two small aspects. So, let me set the record straight for everyone, and let us discuss Tolkien and his view of evil, and how orcs are involved with it. Now, as many of you know and no doubt have seen yelled in the streets and on social media, Tolkien was a devout Roman Catholic, and his religion heavily influenced his work. This is, of course, true. However, something extremely obvious that no one ever mentions is that Tolkien, while Catholic, was a fan of pagan myths, and his work is also heavily influenced by paganism. You see, there was no standard fantasy involving dwarves, elves, and orcs before him, or, the Tolkien-esque fantasy, hence the name, because he made that and shaped modern fantasy. We all know this, but no one acknowledges that in order to do that, Tolkien needed to take a lot of influence and study from pagan beliefs and stories. And so his work, while fundamentally Christian, was also heavily pagan. However, the mythology of his world had a fundamental Christian influence. Eru Ilúvatar is the one true God, and is obviously a stand-in for Yahweh or the Abrahamic Judeo-Christian God. He is all-powerful and all-good, and because he is all-powerful and all-good, then there is a fundamental and pure good in the setting. And you might think right there is the answer, that if there is a pure good, then there must be things that can be inherently evil, and so Tolkien's works should be viewed through a lens of black and white. But that is not entirely correct. Tolkien believed in pure evil, but he did not believe in inherent evil. Nothing in Tolkien's legendarium began as evil, even if eventually some things were pure evil. Let's talk about Melkor, also known as Morgoth, who is the main Satan figure of the setting. You see, when Eru made the Ainur, or Valar, or the angelic spirits that are his direct sons and daughters, or they don't really have genders, but you know what I mean, and that are essentially the lesser deities and the caretakers of Earth in the setting, and by the way, Earth is called Arda in Tolkien's world. The most powerful of them all was Melkor. Melkor was loyal and good, but he had an independent streak. He went out and searched the endless void, which is literally a space of pure nothingness. It's kind of outside of creation, to find Eru's flame imperishable. And the flame imperishable is essentially the concept of Eru's ability to create life. And, if you see the movies and you see Gandalf talking to the Balrog and he says, "I am a servant of the secret fire," that is the flame imperishable. And Melkor did this because he was curious and wanted his own life to make. Well, he could find nothing, of course, and then Eru had him and all of the Valar sing in a fashion. Now, it was not really singing, it was something that we call music because it is an incomprehensible thing to mortals. However, it's a metaphor that works well, the singing part. And Eru Ilúvatar orchestrated the singing of the Valar. Melkor sung out of tune and made discordant sounds because he wanted to make his own music. However, every time he did this, it ended up serving the greater song despite his wish to disrupt the music. Sort of like if you're tuning a guitar, trying to ruin a concert, but every sound you make ends up flowing with the songs that they're playing. And this was Tolkien's answer to the problem of evil in a world that began as pure good. And I think it's actually an excellent way to view Christian theology. Some call it spabimi, but that's just an acronym for Eru's quote, which is, "shall prove but mine instrument." I'll read the full quote here. "And thou, Melkor, shalt see that no theme may be played that hath not its uttermost source in me, nor can any alter the music in my despite. For he that attempteth this shall prove but mine instrument, in the devising of things more wonderful, which he himself hath not imagined." And that means this: the world is made from Eru, and all things stem from him, and that means it begins as good and shall end as good, and that anyone who deviates from the path of goodness shall never prosper in the long run, and will find out that all of their evil deeds will do nothing but further the cause of good. So though the world is all good, even those that seek to make it not all good will end up just aiding in the path of goodness, all according to God's plan. And that is true. After Melkor went to Earth and corrupted the Earth by his presence, eventually he was defeated and the world was good. And even though Sauron, his greatest servant, Morgoth's greatest servant, came after, he too was eventually defeated and the world became what it was meant to be. And Melkor, Sauron, Saruman, and even the Orcs were once good, but became corrupted because they wished to rebel from goodness. You see, in Tolkien's worldview, evil is not the antithesis of good. Evil is a corruption, which is like a temporary sickness of good. Now, what does this have to do with if orcs are always evil or not? Well, first we need to establish what an orc is. Tolkien gave us many origins for orcs. First, he said that they came from stone or mud, and Melkor gave them life, but he threw that away quickly because he decided no one could give life except Eru, or God. Then he made them corrupted elves, or elves that awoke in the world and were captured and tortured and ruined by Melkor. And just to be clear, Melkor also placed his power into orcs, his corrupted power, imbuing them with his corruption, in a fashion. They were truly a ruined and terrible form of life. Then Tolkien said there were corrupted men, meaning the orcs, and then he said there were corrupted men and elves, and he never could quite figure out what they were. But the main and most popular origin, and the one that's in all the official sources, is that they were once elves, and they were kidnapped and then corrupted by Melkor or Morgoth, and then they bred into a separate race of monstrous and cruel beings. However, does this inherent corruption mean they are inherently evil? No, it does not. However, because of orc society, because of their dark masters, because of their corruption, the odds of an orc actually becoming good, while possible, are so monumentally low that over a dozen volumes from Tolkien, being his novels and his supplementary books and compiled notes, we never see a single one that is good, even if it is possible. And the very wise in the First Age knew this. Here, let me read an excerpt from the work titled Morgoth's Ring. "But even before this wickedness of Morgoth was suspected, the wise in the elder days taught always that orcs were not made by Melkor, and therefore were not in their origin evil. They might have become irredeemable, at least by elves and men, but they remained within the law, or Eru's law. That is, that though of necessity, being the fingers of the hand of Morgoth, they must be fought with the utmost severity, they must not be dealt with in their own terms of cruelty and treachery. Captives must not be tormented, not even to discover information for the defense of the homes of elves and men. If any orcs surrendered and asked for mercy, they must be granted it, even at a cost. This was the teaching of the wise, though in the horror of the war it was not always heeded." And here's a footnote of the text. "Few orcs ever did so in the elder days," as in asked for mercy. "And at no time would any orc treat with any elf, for one thing Morgoth had achieved was to convince the orcs beyond refutation that the elves were crueler than themselves, taking captives only for amusement, or to eat them, as the orcs would do to the elves, or at need. It is true, of course, that Morgoth held the orcs in dire thraldom, for in their corruption they had lost almost all possibility of resisting the domination of his will. So great indeed did its pressures upon them become ere Angband fell, that if he turned his thoughts towards them, they were conscious of his eye wherever they might be. And when Morgoth was at last removed from Arda, the orcs that survived in the west were scattered, leaderless, and almost witless, and were for a long time without control or purpose. Okay, now this is a quote on orc origins and how they act under the thraldom of a Dark Lord, being Melkor this time. However, we do need to acknowledge that orcs don't suddenly or even gradually become good without a Dark Lord. They followed Morgoth and Sauron out of fear, but without that fear, they were still inclined to banditry and slaughter. One only needs to read the conversation between Gorbad and Shagrat in the Two Towers. These are two orcs who Sam overhears after Shelob stabs Frodo and Sam fights Shelob off. Here's what they say.
"No, I don't know," said Gorbag's voice. "The messages go through quicker than anything could fly, as a rule, but I don't inquire how it's done. Safest not to. Those Nazgul give me the creeps, and they skin the body off you as soon as look at you, and leave you all cold in the dark on the other side. But he likes them. They're his favorites nowadays, so it's no use grumbling. I tell you, it's no game serving down in the city." "You should try being up here with Shelob for company," said Shagrat. "I'd like to try somewhere where there's none of them, but the war's on now, and when that's over, things may be easier." "It's going well, they say." "They would," grunted Gorbag. "We'll see. But anyway, if it does go well, there should be a lot more room. What do you say? If we get a chance, you and me will slip off and set up somewhere on our own with a few trusty lads. Somewhere where there's good loot, nice and handy, and no big bosses." "Ah," said Shagrat, "like old times."
Hope you enjoyed the voices. As you can see, even before the orcs really had to contend with Sauron, they were raiding and pillaging, and that after the war is over and they're no longer soldiers for the Dark Lord, they might set up shop and go killing and raiding again. Sounds like a great retirement. And finally, let me read a quote from Tolkien, letter 153 of the collection of Tolkien's letters, talking to a man named Peter Hastings, who was wondering about the nature of evil and if evil could create. This quote is about orcs and trolls, or the races corrupted in mockery of the goodly ones. Here it is. "They would at least be real physical realities in the physical world, however evil they might prove, even if mocking the children of God. They would be Morgoth's greatest sins, abuses of his highest privilege, and would be creatures begotten of sin, and naturally bad. I nearly wrote irredeemably bad, but that would be going too far, because by accepting or tolerating their making, necessary to their actual existence, even orcs would become part of the world, which is God's and ultimately good. But whether they could have souls or spirits seems a different question. And since in my myth, at any rate, I do not conceive of the making of souls or spirits, things of an equal order if not an equal power to the Valar, as possible delegation, I have represented at least the orcs as pre-existing real beings on whom the Dark Lord has exerted the fullness of his power in remodeling and corrupting them, not making them. That God would tolerate that seems no worse theology than the toleration of calculating dehumanizing of men by tyrants that goes on today." Okay, so it seems that Tolkien is comparing orcs to the dictators and the men who follow them during his life in World War I, II, and the Cold War, and that there is no shortage of men who are capable of killing babies and starving families and doing all manner of evil for profit. Now, does all this mean that orcs are inherently evil? No, it does not. If an elf found an orc baby and raised it amongst elves, it would undoubtedly be more moral than any orc we had ever seen. But it would have an inclination, not towards evil, but mischief and acts of cruelty now and again, and definitely it would have a lot of self-loathing. You see, while orcs aren't inherently evil, as they are corrupted and ruined, they have a natural inclination towards it. Orcs are very much like Gollum, a creature that used to be good, but has been twisted and corrupted to the point where they no longer look like what they once were, and cannot go back, and yet they are also capable of doing good and are not inherently evil. Except, unlike Gollum, orcs don't remember a time when they were good, and so it's just easier to be corrupted and evil. There is no reason to be good, and being cruel feels natural and good to them, even though they have the capability of being good. And so both sides are wrong. No, orcs aren't inherently evil, but they aren't victims either. And people who say Tolkien's works are pure good versus pure evil have a slight point. We also need to acknowledge that though there is pure good and pure evil, there is no pure good on Arda or Earth, which is the name for Earth in Tolkien's Legendarium, because Melkor's fall made the Earth flawed. And so, on Earth, there is no pure good. And so now, even the kindest person can be mean, and even the most honest person can lie. And orcs, while not wholly evil, live in a world where their corruption can flourish. And so pretty much all orcs are vicious, cruel, dishonest, and greedy. Not because they can only be that way, but because of the corruption of their beings and the world they live in, and because even if they have the capability to fight that nature, they really have no reason to. Everyone is flawed and everyone is capable of evil. Orcs are just more flawed, and becoming good is always going to be an uphill battle, even if it is not impossible and they are not born wicked. Okay guys, I hope this video made sense. Thanks so much for watching. I always welcome your comments, and please like, share, and subscribe if you think I deserve it. See ya!